Herzlich willkommen zur 45. Ausgabe von Rechtsgespräch, dem Podcast über Innovationen im Rechtsmarkt und Zugang zum Recht. Am Mikrofon Kurt Brügmann, meine Gäste heute Jacque Lethbridge und Edgar Kuhimbisa. Jacque Lethbridge ist Präsidentin der Neuseeland Law Society. Ihr Geld verdient sie als Partnerin einer Wirtschaftskanzlei. Sie hat allerdings Erfahrung auch als Strafverteidigerin gesammelt und als Anwältin einer Organisation, die sich um Rechte der Maori kümmert. Mit ihr spreche ich über Community Law Centers, über Frauen in der Anwaltschaft und darüber, warum es sich lohnt, für einen Teil des Jurastudiums nach Neuseeland zu gehen. Mein zweiter Gast, Edgar Kuhimbisa. Edgar ist kein Jurist, aber tätig für das Justizministerium in Uganda. Dort kümmert er sich um Data-Driven Justice. Das ist ein Programm, mit dem die ugandische Regierung versucht, Rechtspolitik auf eine empirische Basis zu stellen. Besonders wichtig in einem Land, das noch die Folgen eines der längsten gewaltsamen Konflikte auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent spürt. Mein Lesetipp am Ende dieser Folge: Everything is obvious once you know the answer. How Common Sense Fails von Duncan J. Watts. Ich freue mich, wenn Sie helfen, wenn ihr helft, dass dieser Podcast in den gängigen Podcast-Playern automatisch vorgeschlagen wird, wenn sich jemand für Recht und Politik interessiert. Das geht ganz einfach, nämlich durch eure Kommentare und vor allem durch eure 5-Sterne-Bewertung bei Spotify und in der Apple Podcast-App. So wird das Rechtsgespräch unter den vielen Podcasts noch sichtbarer. Bevor wir einsteigen, kommt jetzt ein Hinweis auf den Sponsor dieses Podcasts: Juris. Juris ist der führende Anbieter von digitalem Rechts- und Praxiswissen in Deutschland. Über das Juris-Portal erhalten Sie Zugriff auf alles, was Sie im Rechtsalltag benötigen. Von Fachliteratur aus der Juris-Allianz bis zu Primärquellen wie Gesetzen und aktueller Rechtsprechung. Laufend aktualisiert und intelligent vernetzt. Jetzt informieren und kostenlos testen unter juris.de. Das war Werbung. Jetzt spreche ich mit einer Rechtsanwältin aus Neuseeland. Sie hat schon für den Public Defence Service gearbeitet. Das ist so eine Art staatlich finanzierte, unabhängige Strafverteidigungsorganisation für mittellose Angeklagte. Für das Waitangi Tribunal, eine Behörde, die den Maoris in Neuseeland zu ihren Rechten verhelfen soll. Und sie ist in mehreren Wirtschaftskanzleien tätig gewesen, in einer sogar als erste weibliche Partnerin. Einer ihrer Schwerpunkte ist das Insolvenzrecht. Und zur Zeit ist sie die Präsidentin der Neuseeland Law Society. Das ist die nationale Anwaltskammer in Neuseeland. Welcome, Jacque Lethbridge, to this episode of the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast.
Kia ora, Kurt. Thank you for welcoming me.
Jacque, do you mind if we start with some facts about New Zealand and its legal market? What would you think is worth knowing for a continental European to have some context?
All right, well, I think I'll just start with the size of our jurisdiction and the kind of country we are. Mm-hmm. So firstly, we're an island nation in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And because of that, we're very multicultural, as many islands end up being. We have a population in New Zealand of just over 5 million people living in New Zealand. And as far as the population of lawyers is concerned, we have just over 16,000 lawyers for that just over 5 million population. So we're relatively isolated, but we have a relatively good proportion of lawyers to the population.
Do you have a split profession? Do you have solicitors and barristers in your jurisdiction?
Yeah, so we actually have a joined profession in the sense that you get admitted when you get admitted to the bar as a barrister and solicitor. So you can practice as a court lawyer, as a barrister and solicitor. So I'm a litigation partner in a mid-tier law firm, and I primarily am a court lawyer. So I have lots of colleagues who are only barristers. We do also have an independent bar, and those barristers effectively do the same job that I do. It's just they don't have a trust account duties as I do in a firm.
What struck me as very interesting, you have quite a high number of female lawyers in New Zealand.
Yes, we do. So for more than 15 years, possibly even more than 20 years actually, we've had more than 50% of the entrance of new lawyers into the profession being women. And we have more than 50%, around about 60% of women lawyers admitted across the board. Although, and it's interesting from an access to justice point of view, we still, I imagine, like many Commonwealth jurisdictions at least, have an issue about getting those women up into the senior parts of the profession and in particular to being business owners.
What do you think are the reasons for the lawyer profession in New Zealand to be so attractive for female law graduates?
Well, I think it's firstly about our culture in New Zealand. We have a culture that has really progressed women and the independence of women in some ways very significantly. So, for example, we were the first country in the world where women got the vote. That says something about the ethos, I guess, of our country. I also wonder to what extent, and I have no proof of this, but the extent to which the Māori people of New Zealand, who are the indigenous people to New Zealand, maybe their culture has had an effect on a better recognition perhaps for women. So I think that's one, that sort of overall societal structure is one thing. The second thing I think is about the safety of our democracy. We've got a very strong democracy in New Zealand. The rule of law is central to a good democracy. And so I think that also lends itself to potentially being more attractive to women. But other than that, I can't really tell you why it is so many women compared to other countries come into the profession. What, though, New Zealand still battles with, as I said before, despite having all those numbers coming into the profession and overall being female within the profession, we do have this real glass ceiling issue getting women through. And that's something that the Law Society is really trying to tackle. It's something I've really dealt with very broadly in my career.
Maybe you can explain to us what the Law Society tries to do to get rid of this glass ceiling, which is a global phenomenon. What can you do as a Law Society?
The first thing is that the New Zealand Law Society has two functions at the moment. The first is as the regulator of the law profession. And one of the things that the Law Society has been putting a huge amount of effort and emphasis on is tackling, since the Me Too movement in 2018, very significant allegations within some parts of our profession, particularly relating to sexual harassment, but generally relating to bullying and harassment. And that tends to, by definition, affect female lawyers more than it does, obviously, male lawyers. So that's the first thing. The second thing is proactively working with other organisations within our profession, like we have a New Zealand Bar Association, and they represent barristers, so barrister souls in New Zealand. And they've worked together with the Law Society on a gender equality charter, which basically sets targets for the percentage of cases which are assigned to female litigation lawyers or barristers. And then another aspect is encouraging big organisations and clients, such as the major commercial banks, to sign up to that charter. So those are a couple of the major things the Law Society have done to try and change the culture.
Thank you very much. We have this appointment to talk about access to justice in New Zealand. Do you have a remarkable access to justice gap, or do you see yourself rather as a country in which there are less thresholds for access to justice?
No, we do have a major issue in New Zealand when it comes to access to justice. What we know is that there's a big gap between those people who are able to access that sort of high quality legal services and other legal services, including legal aid. We call it the squeezed middle. That's those people who earn too much to be able to get legal aid, but not enough to be able to access private fee-paying legal advisors to assist them. And it's been a growing gap, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, with a further pressure on that gap because we have less legal aid lawyers who are available to do the legal aid work. So there's a number of pressure points which mean that we've got this widened gap in New Zealand.
So do I understand you correctly that your access to justice gap is not so much an access to justice gap of the most vulnerable people in society, because you do have a kind of functioning legal aid system?
Well, we have a functioning legal aid system, but only to a certain degree. So last year, the Law Society had such a concern about the position of legal aid in New Zealand that it conducted a very extensive survey of the legal profession using a survey company that's normally used by the government to understand what's happening out in a particular sector, and did that at its own cost. And what that identified is that there was a huge gap between the amount of legal aid need, so clients who wanted legal aid cases to be done, and the number of lawyers who were legal aid lawyers and prepared to be able to do that. It was a very insightful report, and it enabled us, through the results of that, to really lobby the government to show this significant gap and convince them to be able to raise the legal aid rates in New Zealand, so that not only do more clients or members of the public become eligible to receive legal aid, but also so that lawyers got paid more.
So the government actually raised legal aid funding?
Well, yes, they've put a significant injection in of about 140 million New Zealand dollars. That's the single largest injection of funding that has occurred in New Zealand for over 10 years. And the reason that was so required is that the rates that legal aid lawyers were getting paid has not actually even kept up with inflation, and literally hasn't been changed for over a decade. So that funding will go some way to addressing the balance, but it is, we now know, having broken it down, that it really is just a drop in the bucket. So we've still got this major issue at the area where there's the most need. The other way that the government and also the profession assists with that unmet justice gap or need is through the provision of community law centres. And there's a network of community law centres that go right throughout the country. The movement in New Zealand was organic. It was profession-led. It commenced in Auckland at the first community law centre. A grassroots movement of lawyers realised that there was a missing gap for people who just couldn't afford to pay and also weren't eligible for legal aid. They set up what was then called the Grayland Neighbourhood Law Office. This was about 45 years ago, and that became the Auckland Community Law Centre. So it was the first law centre in New Zealand. And soon after that, a large number of similar centres cropped up around the country. And about 12 years ago, a national body, the Community Law Centres of Aotearoa, which is a national umbrella organisation to support individual community law centres, at a national level, was also set up. So that grassroots movement has really taken hold right across the country. We know that for every dollar that's invested by the government in the community law centre space, the value for that ends up being about $9 in terms of the spend and value to the government. So it's a very effective movement and provides significant access to justice for those who just otherwise would never get it.
We might have an idea of what a community law center looks like, but maybe you can draw a picture of such a community law center and the work of a lawyer, maybe a typical work day of a lawyer in a community law center. Which kind of lawyers work there? Are they volunteers? Are they employed there? Which kind of clients go there, and which problems do they come with?
The best example is the one that I'm most familiar with, and I was the chairperson of the Auckland Community Law Centre, the board that effectively runs the Auckland Community Law Centre. So the general structure of these law centres is that there's a charitable trust board that is charged with receiving the funding from the government and other sources, and then overseeing, from a governance perspective, an actual law centre. So typically, like in Auckland, there's a general manager who's a lawyer, and they will hire a team of staff solicitors. Generally, those staff solicitors tend to be relatively new graduates or 1 to 2 year lawyers, or they could be quite experienced lawyers who have just got to the stage where they want to have an ethos of giving back. Through that structure, they provide a really broad range of advice, and some of it can be helping someone out with a budget who's facing a debt recovery matter. They might assist them with dealing with that debt recovery matter, but they might also assist them with some budgeting advice, or at least getting them in touch with a budgeting advisor, right up to dealing with people who, are suffering from domestic violence and they need to get protection orders through the family court. So it's quite a wide range of work. And in the larger centres, such as Auckland, our largest cities in New Zealand, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin, there are also the main law schools and a lot of law school volunteers, and volunteers from law firms will also come in and do triaging nights. to also provide greater access for that law centre to be able to serve the needs of the community. So it's a really broad range of work. By and large, it's low level, but it is in that band of the society that needs that kind of legal assistance and otherwise couldn't get it.
Jackie, what's the relationship between the Law Society and those community law centres? Does the Law Society support this system of law centres?
The Law Society does support in a number of ways. So, the Law Society is there to regulate the profession and also represent them. So the Law Society is involved in ensuring that those law centres have registered practising lawyers pursuant to our rules and regulations. The Law Society also effectively administers quite a lot of the funding that goes to the law centres because they're funded through the interest that accrues on funds held in trust accounts. And so the law profession has essentially gifted that to the community law centre movement by way of funding. So that's a role that the Law Society has. And then the Law Society also supports the law centre movement with new initiatives. And one of them I was directly involved with, again, at the Auckland Community Law Centre. And that was a pilot program that our law centre came up with. We had a very strong board full of lawyers, and at the time, a previous president of the New Zealand Law Society, Catherine Beck, and we came up with an idea of how to address the problem that we were seeing, and we still see, with self-represented litigants in court. We looked to the overseas jurisdictions and came up with a pilot that was run through our High Court to effectively establish a clearinghouse for civil claims where people were representing themselves in areas they just did not have the skill base and ability to represent themselves. So we put together panels of senior lawyers and barristers who agreed to take on that work and run those cases. And the structure of that pro bono clearinghouse pilot became effectively a confirmed program. We called it, using a Māori Te Reo name, Te Ara Ture, which basically is a nationalised clearinghouse where people would otherwise not be able to have lawyers, and that clearinghouse matches senior lawyers together with the cases, and those senior lawyers do those cases for free, but with the support of the clearinghouse. So the New Zealand Law Society really assisted with lobbying the government for funding and helping with, structurally putting that all together. So that's another way that the Law Society really supports access to justice, and particularly in that community law centre space.
Thank you, Jackie. Does legal technology play a role in New Zealand when it comes to access to justice, especially for consumers?
Well, we're getting there, although I would say, and again, this is anecdotal on my part, that we're probably quite behind jurisdictions, probably far behind where Germany are at with use of technology. But technology certainly speeds up the time that cases can take in the courts, and that's obviously where you have a lot of unmet need. We have now, as a result of COVID, got a much greater use, particularly in our higher courts, of technology to be able to have cases heard, but via electronic means. We've got some early uptake on things like AI to try and assist with providing legal services through AI technology. That has so far really only been in the larger law firms, but the community law centres are really working hard at a national level to look at how AI can really assist consumers to be able to access justice better. So I think we will see, as we saw with the uptake in New Zealand in the courts of electronic filing and hearings, we'll see that accelerate very quickly, I imagine, over the next sort of 2 to 5 years.
Jackie, we have to slowly come to the end of our conversation. I do have 2 more questions. The first, just out of curiosity, New Zealand is such a dream destination for many young Germans. Are your law schools open to European law students? I saw that you have about 100 German-speaking lawyers even in New Zealand.
Yes, well, I think because we are a destination that sort of a dream destination, as you put it, in terms of our environment and the kind of relaxed culture and welcoming culture that we have. I actually undertook my master's in law at Auckland University, and there is actually a number of German, in particular, students undertaking that LLM course, and that's quite a regular thing to occur in our universities from all over Europe and also the UK. I think it's an opportunity to experience a Commonwealth jurisdiction while also having a much more relaxed sort of vibe to your experience. It's not super competitive, but you've also got access to the legal academics in New Zealand are world leading because we're not only attractive to students, we're attractive to lecturers and academics. And so you're getting a high quality of that education if you're coming from overseas. And you've also got the benefit of being able to hop on a plane one day and go skiing in Queenstown, or jumping in a car and going up to the Bay of Islands and being, right next to the beautiful emerald water. So, I think it's a great destination. I'd really encourage any students from Germany that are listening to this to think about giving New Zealand a go.
My last question, Jackie, when I gave a quick overview over your CV in my German language introduction, I told my listeners about your amazing career. You were a first female in many positions. You managed to juggle your career and a little child. What would be your career advice for a law student who is not sure which path to choose between work-life balance and a power career?
As you point out, across the last 20 years of my career, 18 years of that practicing, I have been part of actually still, even though it seems odd, quite a few firsts. So being the first female partner in 2 firms and a range of other things. But things have moved on quite significantly, even in the last 5 years, actually. And I think in terms of the range of things areas you can practice in, you can practice in-house and you can practice in private practice. You can move easily between private practice and in-house if you would like to. And I think you can, with relative ease at the junior part of your career, and I'd really encourage young lawyers, and I always do, to do this, to use that early part of your career to really try different areas of practice. I did that. I started off, as you said in your German introduction, at the Waitangi Tribunal, working in the Treaty of Waitangi space. And then I moved into doing criminal law for 5 years, which was incredibly rewarding, but also challenging. And then after doing my master's part-time, I wasn't afraid to jump into civil litigation, which is where I've ended up and where my career's been. And it's meant that I was able to try several different things before deciding where I'd ultimately land. And I can say at 43, and having been around for about 20 years, I can see that if I wanted to, I could probably start in a different area again. And that's one of the great things about being flexible, and I think it's more so the case now. I also think we've just got a better culture, and I'm sure this is the same for those jurisdictions overseas, and particularly in Germany. There's much more awareness that we're not just at work. We truly want to have that balance between working and our lives. We don't want our whole lives to be about working. And the profession here in New Zealand is really focusing on how we can practice better, use technology so people can kind of practice from anywhere if they need to. And we're also doing things like looking at maternity leave, but also paternity leave, making sure that we're giving fathers the opportunity to take time off. And that's important not only for them, but it's also important for supporting women lawyers who often end up in a worse position because they have to take time off to child rear. So I feel like the future, or right now and what's coming into the future, is kind of the dream time to be practicing, really. I feel like we're on this precipice between having lots of innovation and having occurred, and a whole new world of innovation yet to come. So I think it's quite an exciting time for any new lawyer entering the profession. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all the possibilities that come out of the next 2 to 5 years.
Jacque Lethbridge, thank you so much for this most interesting and enjoyable Rechtsgespräch conversation.
Thank you, Kurt. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Nun spreche ich mit einem Gast, der für das Justizministerium in Uganda arbeitet. Dort koordiniert er Programme zur Einführung der elektronischen Justiz und der digitalen Transformation im Recht. Dazu gehören auch Tools, um den digitalen Zugang zum Recht zu stärken. Ich habe ihn vor mehr als 2 Jahren kennengelernt, als er vor Tech-Entrepreneurs darüber sprach, wie Uganda die Digitalisierung nutzt, um die Justiz zu modernisieren. In den sozialen Medien nutzt er oft den Hashtag Data-Driven Justice. Welcome to the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast, Edgar Kuhimbisa.
Thank you, Cord. Glad to be here. I love this show and love this podcast, and I'm so happy to, be part of this conversation.
Can we start with you giving us some facts about Uganda?
So Uganda, the Pearl of Africa, that's what we call it. Easily the most beautiful country on earth, gifted by nature, home to the longest river in the world, the second largest freshwater body in the world. I'm sure you've heard about Lake Victoria. Mm-hmm. We are home to the world famous flora and fauna. I'm sure many of you have heard the world famous mountain gorilla in southwestern Uganda, where I come from, by the way. Uganda is found in East Africa between Kenya, the DRC, Sudan, and Tanzania. We're technically a landlocked country, but arguably we're at the center of the continent. I would say the center of gravity of the African continent is located right here in Uganda, the heart of Africa, with the equator cutting through. And so somehow I think Uganda could be the Garden of Eden that we've all been looking out for. Our population is about 40 to 40 million shillings, depending on what data you're looking at, but with a very young population. 77% of Uganda's population is under 25 years old. Mm-hmm. So that makes us one of the youngest countries in the world. But just a little bit about our history. It's a tumultuous past, actually. I think that gives us very good context, Cord, in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, especially when it comes to justice reform. So we've had a tumultuous, painful past going back to the 70s and the 80s, defined by war, injustice, breakdown of the rule of law. We've had a period of political and civil and economic regression in this country. But in the 1990s, as part of our government reform initiatives, we've been able to reinvent ourselves, come up with justice reform programs and initiatives that have truly changed the landscape of Uganda's justice sector and the socioeconomic state as a country. And I'm happy to be talking about that later on in the podcast.
I would love to talk more about the general situation, but we should get to the justice system. Can you also give us some information, some numbers, some figures about the justice sector?
So basically operate a common law system because we're colonized by the British. And so our system doesn't differ so much from the British justice system. I think that applies pretty much to every former British colony. As far as Uganda is concerned, like I said before, we've had a difficult past that has really been defined by a lot of injustice, going back into the 90s and 80s. And we've been able to rise above the ashes, rise above the painful past, and challenge ourselves to be better, challenge ourselves to go ahead in life. And I just want to tell you what we did in the 1990s as part of our government reform initiative.
Yes, please.
We were able to form a program known as the Justice Law and Order Sector, commonly known as JLOS. And JLOS is an innovative approach aimed at increasing communication, coordination, and cooperation among several stakeholders in access to justice and administration of justice in Uganda. And so the idea here is that you have so many players within the justice space, and JLOS brings them together under a framework of cooperation, collaboration, communication, and we work together seamless, to deliver an efficient and effective justice system. And that's not without its own challenges. But over the last 20 years, we've been able to figure out how we can collaboratively deliver meaningful justice to our people, to our communities. And that has been one of our hallmarks of our justice reform program, where we've been able to have government take the lead, but also bring on board players within the private sector, within the civil society domain, even within the private sector. And I think that has sort of created a lot of synergies that have truly transformed the way we look at things, but also results on the ground. We have lawyers as part of our service delivery architecture as well. Many of our young people have graduated from law school and they have so many law firms across the country. Very innovative young lawyers in this country that are part of our service delivery architecture. You'd be amazed at how many young people are out there in our communities providing legal aid. We call it pro bono service, working with women, working with children, trying to make a change. And many of them are not even paid a lot of money, but because JLOS has given them a platform to be able to innovate, to create solutions, local solutions to local problems. That has really created a truly remarkable workforce within the justice system that doesn't only include lawyers, but also social justice actors, magistrates, prison warders, police officers. So you look at this ecosystem and it's truly wonderful to say that I've been honored to be part of it, contributing in a small way to how this justice machinery works. And so that is where we stand as the justice system in Uganda. I think JLOS truly represents our overall approach to access to justice delivery.
Edgar, thank you very much. You already answered my next question about the actors in the justice system beyond the traditional lawyer profession. Maybe you can give us an example, maybe a best practice example from your JLOS program. What does JLOS do for the justice system concretely?
So JLOS, first of all, is designed to tackle what we call systemic challenges that exist, when it comes to issues of access to justice. I mean, some of this is quite familiar, I'm sure, because the justice challenges and issues are pretty much common across the globe. But you're looking at decline in access to justice, case backlog in courts, high prison populations or prison congestion, lack of effective procedural guidelines and performance standards, significant gender discrimination, gender-based violence as well. And then you have children who come in contact with the law. And how do you address some of those complicated dynamics when it comes to access to justice? And so JLOS pretty much has been designed, I believe, to address what I call the kitchen table justice issues. Some of them are civil in nature, like land disputes, like disputes with neighbors, issues to do with employment disputes and all that. And so those are the issues that our people face, and we've designed a system to try to meet them at that point of need. So, for example, we have what we call the local council courts. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much an informal justice mechanism where we've mobilized communities within themselves to be able to solve some of these issues and challenges and disputes they have without having to go to the formal courts, which perhaps already clogged with a lot of cases. And you'll be able to have your case perhaps settled within 4 or 5 years. But because of what we've created in communities, for example, through the local council courts, we're able to have communities get together through their community leadership and resolve some of these, in a way, impactful justice problems and challenges. And that, in a way, has helped us to decongest the justice system. It's a work in progress, and we're hoping that we can perfect it along the way, working with development partners, but also working with all the other players that I mentioned along the way. Maybe I can also mention something that we've been working on called legal aid. Many of our people live in rural areas and they don't live in cities. And so we have to make sure that we meet them at that point and appreciate the issues and challenges that they face. And so through our legal aid programs, we work with formal institutions such as the courts, where we have established legal aid institutions, but also we work with the communities, where we have legal aid service providers within the civil society domain. And we visit the women that are having land issues, and we try to make sure that we find them in their homes and we appreciate their issues, their challenges, provide them legal representation, and make sure that at the end of the day, justice is delivered. And in a way, this is quite different from a typical formal system where issues of justice are settled within the court via a litigation process. We've found ways of mediation where you don't have to go through a long process of solving a dispute. You get people together through what we call the alternative dispute resolution mechanism. You have people meaningfully settle these disputes amicably, and it's sort of like a win-win situation. And so that is what we call people-centered justice at the end of the day. And that has improved the justice journey of our people. I believe it's a best practice that we can employ across the globe to be able to truly deliver meaningful access to justice, not just quantity, but quality justice.
Edgar, for us to understand those alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, were they introduced as government institutions and tools, or do you also use traditional means of dispute resolution that might exist in your country?
Well, it's a hybrid. And, what we do is that we understand what the communities want at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. I'm sure many of you, our listeners, perhaps are very familiar with the LRA war in Uganda that ravaged the northern part of our country in the early 80s and the late 80s and in the 90s and a bit of the 2000s. And so in order to reconcile our communities after this long period of war, we're able to employ traditional mechanisms of justice without having to go through the punitive mechanisms that, in a way, deliver punishment. But we've been able to employ traditional approaches where victims and perpetrators of these crimes have been able to forgive one another and find restoration as a result. But also, we've been able to employ traditional mechanisms to make sure that those who've committed crimes face justice, but justice that is defined by the communities, not defined by other players somewhere in a boardroom, because we feel that at the end of the day, It's the communities that know what's best for them. And so when it comes to mediation, we try to understand the local context. That is very, very key, because when it comes to land disputes, some of these issues go way back. They're entrenched within our traditional systems and history. And we have to be able to understand all that to be able to meaningfully deliver justice. And that also helps sustain peace, because especially in areas of this country that have been ravaged by war, there is a lot of pain and the need for retribution. So it's very difficult sometimes to impose a certain system on these people. You have to allow them to be able to define what justice means for them and then allow them to go through that process. And that's what JLOS does. We try to make sure that we involve communities, citizen engagement and citizen participation and access to justice. And that, in a way, has been a game changer and in a way helps improve public trust in what we do and confidence in the services that we provide.
You talked about the quality of delivering justice and a little bit about the quantity. What I would like to know is, in Uganda, where do you get your information about access to justice gaps from? What does data-driven justice in this context mean?
Oh, that's a very good question. Going back to the 1990s, or maybe just at the time when we formed this JLOS reform program, we've always underpinned our justice reform agenda on facts and evidence.
Okay.
So our 5-year strategic development plans over the years have focused on a wide range of justice initiatives on data collected across a wide spectrum of justice issues, challenges, solutions, experiences, and even best practices. And we analyze this data to make a case for reform and investment. And so when we speak about data-driven justice in the Ugandan context, this simply means leveraging data and evidence to drive justice reform. So that way we're able to target our resources and best efforts on actual issues that matter and implement solutions that work. So interestingly, our communities in Uganda are so diverse and we speak so many languages. And so diversity is something that we're pretty much used to here in this country. And we've been able to leverage that to make sure that we try to bring everyone on the table. And so we're able to work with the civil society organizations that pretty much have very good systems and platforms in our communities, and we leverage them to be able to provide us that data. So while we cannot reach where government does not have a footprint, our civil society partners perhaps have a footprint. And because of our collaborative nature of work, we're able to leverage all these multiple sources of data to be able to answer these questions. And so when we go to the Ministry of Finance and we want a budget perhaps to roll out a new justice reform initiative, maybe an innovation to improve case management or an initiative to improve customer experience, we're able to say, this has proved to work. This is what is going on the ground. This is exactly what we think will happen if we're able to make this kind of investment. And in a way that helps us to make our case. And that, I think, has really moved JLOS up the food chain when it comes to sharing national resources, because everyone understands that when you fund justice, when you fund justice reform, you are actually transforming the country socioeconomically. You have a happier population. You have a more peaceful society because people feel that their justice issues will be met, but also the cost of justice significantly reduces because you've developed these innovative mechanisms in communities that quickly enable people to access justice. Data-driven justice is really a buzzword for many, but for us, we've really seen it in action. And over the years, I think it has really worked for us. It's work in progress, and we hope to keep going and even doing much better.
This is a podcast about access to justice, innovation, and technology. Tell us about what you think about technology as a tool to bridge the access to justice gap.
Well, technology is increasingly playing a critical role in our justice reform agenda. Here in Uganda, institutions such as the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, the prisons, the police, the immigration office, national identification and registration services have all begun to adopt ICTs, to increase or to create an environment of efficiency and effectiveness across the JLOS service delivery architecture through automated business registries, e-filing in courts, national ID processing, criminal identification, for example, those who've committed crime, how you can automatically identify them, leveraging some of these technologies. That has created new opportunities, has created new digital realities. The justice system traditionally is a bit closed in, but thanks to our partnership with forward-looking players like the Hague Institute for the Innovation of Law, that many of us on this podcast that are very familiar with, we've been able to open up the justice space to new ideas, to new thinking, to innovation. So at the end of the day, who benefits more from this? The ordinary Ugandan on the street who owns a shop out there and wants to formalize their business. When they go to the registration bureau, they're able to have very effective service thanks to automation. And they're able to register their businesses thanks to automation because it doesn't take a long time. It takes just a matter of hours. They're able to have national IDs because national ID is a human right, because without a national ID, you can't access services. And so a lack of a national ID, for example, in a way is an injustice when you look at it broadly. But we're also mindful of the digital gap. As we try to roll out technology, we believe that if we're not careful, we end up creating digital exclusion. And because there's a lot of people in this country that don't have access to internet, working with the private sector, we've been able to increase the penetration of internet connectivity across the country through what we call the National Backbone Infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That is a government-funded program that is extending internet connectivity to every corner of this country in a way that is going to really drive this IT revolution in access to justice. And we believe the best is yet to come.
Do you have a best practice example that you can share with us when it comes to legal technology entrepreneurs? You told us about the young lawyers in your country that are very innovative. Is there maybe a story that you could share with us?
Absolutely. One of the things that we have to do is to allow ourselves to dream, to think beyond our own limitations, to be able to dream of what the future really would look, and then begin to work towards that vision. And we call that vision engineering. And one of the ways that we've been doing that is to engage every institution to define their vision for the future. How do you envision the judiciary? How do you envision the courts in the next 20, 30 years? How do you envision policing in the next 20, 30 years? How do you envision your work as a magistrate, as a judge, as a police officer in the next 20, 30 years? And then when we define that vision, it enables us to plug in the technology aspects of it. And because technology is pretty much available, but it has to really drive something. That's justice for all is our overall vision. And so I would say that don't be afraid to think big, but then again, don't be afraid to start small. And I'm going to give you an example of what we've been able to start small and we build on some of those small, quick wins to be able to be where we are. So many years ago, in the 1990s, in Uganda, we barely had technology within access to justice. And so many of the processes were manual, certainly, and that's still the case in many instances across the country, wherever you go. At that time, we began to come up with the idea of what we call e-justice, e-justice. And that was a sort of like a strange word at the time, but we were able to, working with visionary leadership within the justice sector, to define what that really means. And it simply meant, how can we be able to have justice processes that are powered by technology when it comes to delivering a truly meaningful justice space for Ugandans. And so we've been able to, over the years, for example, slowly but carefully and surely automate the courts. And so we began with some of the systems that you would call archaic right now, the legacy systems, but we were able to evolve and allow ourselves to grow. And right now, I can tell you, Cord, we've reached a stage right now within the courts where we are doing e-filing. That was unheard of 10 years ago because we're able to create a platform where you don't have to go to the court to file your case. You don't have to go to the bank to pay court fees or to pay bail fees or whatever fees you're required to pay. You can do that in the comfort of your home. And that is happening right here in this country. It's being driven by a collective effort to think big, because right now we're working with a multiple group of stakeholders that has enabled us to create the systems of engagement within the justice system, case management systems that I think are going to deliver game-changing value. And so right now in the courts, we have what we call the electronic case management system that's just gone live, I think, a couple of months ago, that we believe is going to change the justice landscape. Of course, just like any technology initiative, it's always challenged by so many administrative and technical issues. But we've allowed ourselves to learn from our mistakes. We've allowed ourselves to learn from these challenges and then develop the muscle that we need to move forward. That's what I can say to entrepreneurs in this space. Again, maybe lastly, innovate. Think outside the box. You don't have to do it the same way from today and tomorrow and forever. Create new realities, new mechanisms of doing things. Don't box yourself in. And you know what? The sky is the limit.
Edgar Kuhimbisa, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for this Rechtsgespräch conversation.
I'm glad to be here and thank you for having me.
Und nun zum Lesetipp. Ich empfehle in dieser Folge Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. How Common Sense Fails von Duncan J. Watts. Damit empfehle ich ein Buch, das erst auf den zweiten Blick etwas mit den Themen dieses Podcasts zu tun hat. Dieser zweite Blick lohnt sich aber. Eigentlich erklärt der Titel schon sehr gut, worum es geht. Dem Autor geht es darum zu verstehen, warum wir Antworten auf Fragen nach menschlichem Verhalten so häufig als selbstverständlich ansehen, wenn wir einen Erklärungsversuch hören, ob dieser nun richtig oder falsch ist. Was heißt das? Duncan Watts erklärt es mit einem Beispiel des Soziologen Paul Lazarsfeld. Der beschrieb einmal, dass er in seinen Forschungen herausgefunden habe, dass Männer, die aus ländlichen Gegenden kamen, in den 1940ern während ihrer Militärzeit in besserer Stimmung waren als Männer aus Städten. Duncan Watts erläutert uns, dass einem das ja sofort einleuchtet und dass man sich das auch plausibel damit erklären kann, dass diese Männer eben ein härteres Leben gewohnt waren, ist doch offensichtlich. Diese Erklärung funktioniert, bis man erfährt, dass Lazarsfeld uns getäuscht hat. Das Ergebnis seiner Studien war, dass es Männern aus Städten besser ging im Militärdienst als den Soldaten vom Lande. Und schon erklärt man sich das auch wieder ganz plausibel. Dieses Mal damit, dass Stadtmenschen eben Arbeiten auf engem Raum besser kennen, sowie Organisationen mit Kommandoketten, strengen Kleidervorschriften und so weiter. Ist doch offensichtlich. Mit diesem Beispiel, ein klares Ergebnis hat eine offensichtliche Erklärung und das gegenteilige Ergebnis auch, bereitet Duncan Watts den Boden für eine unterhaltsame Reise durch Vorzüge und Schwierigkeiten des gesunden Menschenverstandes. Er bezeichnet es als das Common-Sense-Paradox, dass der gesunde Menschenverstand hilft, die Welt zu verstehen, dass er aber gleichzeitig unsere Fähigkeit, sie zu begreifen, beeinträchtigt. Duncan Watts beginnt mit einem Kapitel über den Common Sense, eben den gesunden Menschenverstand, in dem er die Bedeutung der gelernten Common Sense-Regeln betont, ohne die wir gar nicht durchs Leben gehen könnten. Hier genüge es zu wissen, dass man das ebenso macht, dass es so ist. Man sollte gar nicht so viel darüber nachdenken. Common Sense beruhe auf vielen kleinen Mini-Regeln, die das Leben mit anderen überhaupt erst möglich machten. Eine interessante Beobachtung: So etwas sei besonders schwierig auf Computer zu übertragen, eben weil sich die vielen kleinen Common-Sense-Regeln nicht von einem Grundgesetz ableiten ließen, sondern sozusagen von unten gelernt seien. So sei es heute noch praktisch unmöglich, einen Roboter zu trainieren, unauffällig eine U-Bahn zu benutzen, weil diese simple Aufgabe die Kenntnis so vieler Mini-Regeln umfasse, vom Abstand halten über die Frage, wer wem einen Platz anbietet, Höflichkeit, Fairness und so weiter, dass man das kaum per Algorithmus vorgeben könne. An diesen und anderen Beispielen macht Duncan Watts deutlich, es ist eigentlich so etwas wie ein im Leben mit anderen gelerntes, stillschweigendes, gemeinsam geteiltes Wissen über die Welt und den Alltag, das den Common Sense ausmacht. Da wird es aber auch schon wieder schwierig. Denn wenn Common Sense auf geteiltem Wissen und geteilten Erfahrungen beruhe, gelte er eben nur für diese Gruppe. Und wenn andere Gruppen, ob ganze Kulturen oder Subkulturen, andere stillschweigende Spielregeln hätten, dann sei Common Sense doch nicht allgemeingültig, sondern relativ. Das alles, schreibt Watts, sei nicht weiter problematisch, weil der Halt, den Common Sense gebe, die Nachteile überwiege. So sage ich es jedenfalls mal mit meinen Worten. Schwierig werde es aber dann, wenn man den gesunden Menschenverstand als Maßstab zur Gestaltung von Politik und Gesetzgebung nutze. Und hier sind wir dann auch bei einem Leitmotiv dieses Podcasts, in dem ich mit meinen Gästen ja versuche zu verstehen, wo die Politik, die den Zugang zum Recht gestaltet, und die Berufspolitik im Rechtsmarkt vielleicht zu sehr auf dem Bauchgefühl der Akteurinnen und Akteure beruhen. Wir haben zu viel von Ideologie, Intuition, politischem Druck und irrationalen Stimmungen in der Bevölkerung geprägte Rechtspolitik. Evidenzbasierte Rechtspolitik, meine ich, wäre bessere Rechtspolitik. Ende Exkurs. Und zurück zum Buch. Es ist spannend, wie der Autor auf simple Experimente aus der Physik zurückgreift, in denen unser gesunder Menschenverstand falsche Ergebnisse prognostiziert oder nur mit Mühe versteht, warum eine physikalisch klare Antwort uns einfach nicht einleuchten mag. Ich gebe hier keine Beispiele wieder, weil ich wirklich empfehle, das Buch zu lesen. Duncan Watts macht deutlich, dass wir in der Physik und in anderen Naturwissenschaften gelernt hätten, der Wissenschaft zu vertrauen, eben weil wir verstünden, dass Common-Sense-Antworten nicht funktionierten. Und er fragt, warum es so schwierig ist, diese Erkenntnisse auf die Wissenschaften vom Zusammenleben der Menschen, nämlich die Sozialwissenschaften, zu übertragen. Ein schönes Zwischenfazit, das irgendwo mitten im Buch steht: Gesunder Menschenverstand hilft uns, der Welt einen Sinn zu geben und sie zu erklären, aber nicht, sie wirklich zu verstehen. Duncan Watts beschreibt, wie häufig wir Zirkelschlüssen erliegen, wenn wir Phänomene mit Common Sense zu erklären versuchten, was bedeutet, im Nachhinein zu erklären, dass etwas passierte, weil wir wissen, dass es passierte. Mehr nicht. Psychologinnen nennen das den Hindsight Bias, den Rückschaufehler, bei dem eine Person im Nachhinein merkt, das schon immer gewusst zu haben, aber es in Wirklichkeit natürlich nicht gewusst hat. Die kleine Zerstörung der Geschichtswissenschaften, die Duncan Watts vornimmt unter dem Titel Whoever tells the best story wins, die unterschlage ich hier mal, weil sie auch an meinen Grundfesten als Historiker, der ich ja auch bin, kratzt. Dafür erwähne ich lieber die Abschnitte, der Traum, Vorhersagen treffen zu können und miss nicht nur, sondern experimentiere. Die helfen zu verstehen, wo Möglichkeiten und Grenzen des Verständnisses der Welt und der Gestaltung von Rahmenbedingungen liegen. Und ich empfehle die eigentlich kriminologischen und rechtsphilosophischen Abschnitte im großen Kapitel Fairness and Justice. Die machen übrigens deutlich, dass es für einen nordamerikanisch-australisch geprägten Autor wie Watts recht einfach ist, über die Wissenschaftsdisziplinen hinweg von Justice zu sprechen, während jedenfalls wir deutschsprachig und rechtspositivistisch sozialisierten Juristinnen und Juristen uns damit schwer tun, weil wir fast instinktiv versuchen, Justiz, Recht, Fairness und Gerechtigkeit voneinander zu scheiden, was gut sein kann, und dabei die verbindenden Elemente möglicherweise übersehen, was sicherlich schlecht ist. Die Beispiele aus der anthropologischen, verhaltensökonomischen und sozialpsychologischen Forschung sind lebendig und häufig überraschend. Das Buch ist ein schönes Beispiel für angloamerikanische Populärwissenschaft, die man in Deutschland so kaum findet. Inhaltlich ist das Buch viel mehr als eine schöne Sommerurlaubslektüre, aber es liest sich so gut, dass ich es doch für die Ferienzeit empfehle. Watts Fazit: Lernen, wie eine Soziologin, ein Soziologe zu denken, bedeutet zunächst zu lernen, seine eigenen instinktiven Antworten zu hinterfragen und sie zu verlernen. Das könnte ja auch für uns in der Diskussion um die Regulierung des Rechtsmarkts eine ganz hilfreiche Richtschnur sein. Everything is obvious once you know the answer. How Common Sense Fails von Duncan J. Watts ist im Verlag Atlantic Books erschienen und kostet als Taschenbuch knapp 15 €. Und nun, nach dem Lesetipp, weise ich noch einmal auf den Sponsor dieses Podcasts hin, Juris. Juris ist der führende Anbieter von digitalem Rechts- und Praxiswissen in Deutschland. Über das Juris-Portal erhalten Sie Zugriff auf alles, was Sie im Rechtsalltag benötigen. Von Fachliteratur aus der Juris-Allianz bis zu Primärquellen wie Gesetzen und aktueller Rechtsprechung. Laufend aktualisiert und intelligent vernetzt. Jetzt informieren und kostenlos testen unter juris.de. Das war Werbung. Das war Ausgabe 45 des Rechtsgespräch-Podcasts mit Cord Brügmann. In Folge 46 spreche ich mit Michael Grupp. Das ist der Gründer von Brighter, dem wohl erfolgreichsten deutschen Legal Tech Startup. Wir unterhalten uns unter anderem über das Brighter Center for Digitalization and Law an der EBS-Universität. Mein zweiter Gast ist Helen Hirschbiel von der Oregon State Bar. In Oregon hat der Staats Supreme Court gerade auf Anregung der State Bar einen neuen Rechtsberatungsberuf geschaffen. Damit soll der Rechtsdienstleistungsmarkt diverser werden, sagen Supreme Court und Anwaltskammer. Über Kritik und Anregungen freue ich mich. Und wenn euch diese Folge des Rechtsgespräch-Podcasts gefallen hat, dann abonniert ihn und gebt dem Rechtsgespräch eine 5-Sterne-Bewertung bei Spotify oder besser in der Apple Podcast-App, über die die meisten von euch den Rechtsgespräch-Podcast hören. Bis zum nächsten Mal.